Steve, thank you for joining us today on Rokt Connects. Really appreciate your time. We're going to be talking about navigating the uncertainty during today's times. Steve, previously the chair and CEO of SAC Fifth Avenue, as well as the chair of the National Retail Federation, and now Steve sits and advises on a number of public and private companies. Brings a wealth of experience to the table today. Thank you for joining us.
Happy to join you.
Steve, let's get into it. You've led major retailers through periods of profound disruption before. Given the uncertainty of today's climate, of economic volatility, what do you see as the most critical leadership traits for retail CEOs?
This is a period of enormous uncertainty, probably more than I've seen in almost any other time. I led Saks through the Great Recession in 08, 09, and I think the uncertainty here is even greater than during that period. Not because it's tougher, because I remember seeing our sales go down 25% overnight, but you knew what was happening and you knew where it was going and how you had to navigate. Here, you're in an environment where you don't know what's going to happen one day to the next. And so as a leader, you have to think about what are the rules? And if you don't know the rules of the game, you have to really think differently about leadership. And in an uncertain environment, you've got to have enormous amount of flexibility in the way that you manage and lead an organization. The ability to move on a dime, change your ordering patterns, think about how you shift your marketing dollars, don't have long lead times are paramount, as you may have to change. If you look at all of the Fortune 100 companies, very few of them are sticking to longer term guidance because nobody knows what the answers are going to be. So flexibility is probably the word that I would start this all off.
If I think back to that time of 2007 and 8 that you just mentioned, would I be right in thinking that everyone was dealing with something similar then in how it impacted their business, and probably perhaps more of a rallying cry of the industry, whereas now the way in which supply chains and businesses are set up varies vastly amongst all, and so everyone has their own unique situations that they're trying to navigate this uncertainty? Is that true?
Back then, we all were facing a massive decrease in consumer demand. And that cut across whether you were at the luxury sector or at the dollar store sector of retail. Here, winners and losers. You may be in a situation where you're sourced totally out of the US and you say, this doesn't affect me. Or you may be 100% sourced out of China and say there's enormous amount of impact. I think that you're getting to some more commonality as it's evolving, because with uniform tariffs at whatever it's going to be at a 10% base level, there may be more consistency, but right now there are differences. I would say differences in individual situations, but how you react in terms of not just flexibility, but what are the other leadership tools that you use in an environment, I think are very similar.
Many retailers today are under pressure. I don't think that's changed just because of this moment in time. I think that's been the same since when you were active leading Saks all the way through to now and before then. But short-term results are key, especially for those that are publics, and sometimes that is at the expense of long-term vision. How do you recommend leaders can balance that immediate tactical decision-making and the needs for strategic vision?
It's not an either or. And sometimes you have to make some choices that might affect the short-term profits, either plus or minus, but you also have to have clarity and direction of where you're trying to take an organization. A moment ago, I talked about there were some consistencies about how I thought about whether it was 08, 09 versus today. One of the most important roles of leadership is clarity of strategy and communication to an organization and frequency of communication. So if you have clarity of strategy, then you're going to make some choices that you have to sacrifice or invest in the nearer term to achieve your longer term direction. But you also always have to have that North Star in sight relative to where you want to take the company. As a leader, you're not managing for the quarter, you're managing for the longer term. And sometimes you're going to have a tougher or better individual quarter. The longer term results are what really matter. And that's about shareholder value, whether it's public or private. And I think that you just can't react and just run quarter to quarter. Reminds me a little bit, I used to talk about how you drive a car. There are two ways you can drive a car. If you look right out at the windshield and you just look in front of yourself at the windshield and you're constantly jerking the steering wheel right and left because you're looking just ahead of you. But if you look out ahead down the road a quarter of a mile, you'll be able to see, hey, there's a curve coming up or there's a hill or whatever it might be. And you start gradually turning to go in the direction that you want to go. And I think that you may, as if you just navigate for the quarter, then you're going to be doing this jerky right and left movements. And you've got to have that understanding of where you're taking an organization. And you have to communicate that very clearly to the organization.
That is a good analogy there. I do know those types of people where both in the car, there are people driving like that, but in a work environment where it feels you're zigging and zagging with no long-term or even medium-term vision, it can become very challenging for the people working in that organization to come together and understand the impact of their work there, which is obviously key in a large retailer. Just recently, I was at a CMO function, and there is two schools of thought, which is during times of uncertainty, discretionary spending from brands like marketing has to be pulled back because we don't know what's happening. There are other schools of thought, which is, this is a time we need to spend because we need to be present in market. And similar to a leader thinking about how they lead their team, they think about their positioning in market. The consumers need to know what they're doing and they're present. And my view on that is I found that the brands that have been around for longer fall into that latter bucket, which is, hey, we've been through these tough times before. We know we can come out the other side. Versus the brands and retailers that perhaps in the last 10 years have risen, they're facing this for the first time. And I feel and sense when I'm speaking to those two different camps, and there's obviously those in the middle, that I'm feeling and sensing a very different approach to how they're thinking about this. Would that be fair based upon the retailers that you're speaking with?
Your description is very accurate. Marketing is an easy number to pull back. Company is spending X% of revenue. They look at the P&L, they have a shortfall in the quarter or the year, and someone will say, gosh, we're spending 10% of our budget on marketing. Let's just cut 2% and we can go hit our bottom line. Historically, in many ways, it was easy because you didn't have the ROAS and you didn't have the ability to measure exactly the payback. It was always the old adage of, hey, I'm spending on television dollars and it's 50% effective. I don't know which half's working and which half's what. And so it was easy to go after the dollar. You still have a number of companies that think that way because so much of the marketing is now performance-based that you can measure the returns, you can measure what it's doing to your audiences. There's so much more precision that you really do see the impact on the business. Every company that I'm involved with, when we talk about budget cuts, we talk about what is the short-term and the longer-term volume impact associated with that. What I don't know is whether or not it has to do with older companies versus newer companies. That I'm not sure about. I think it may have to do, in my mind, with more sophisticated versus less sophisticated, or maybe ones with a longer term versus a shorter term vision. Clearly, it may have to do with stronger versus weaker brands. We're in a world right now where strong brands win. And what I mean by that are not just, if I were in the retail space, brands that have a very strong value perception are winning. The Walmarts, the Costcos, the TJXs of the world are winning. In the CPG world, even brands in retail, you're seeing a number of brands that have very strong consumer base, like Birkenstock or Ralph Lauren, go on down the list. I think weaker brands, and sometimes those are newer brands, doesn't have to be a newer brand, weaker brands that don't have as good a consumer franchise, they may jerk back and forth a lot more and start pulling the dollars more quickly than some of the ones that have done the analysis and really understand the ROAS of what they're doing.
The way in which you've described that is probably a better way now, as I'm thinking about those two buckets of age and heritage, but more around brand value and equity, versus perhaps those that have competed on speed and price and quality, but are only 10 years old and they're a younger consumer who's probably looking at how they spend their money a little more closely, perhaps, than other demographics. Now, it wouldn't be a conversation if we didn't talk about AI. As emerging technologies like AI, personalization engines, and automation reshape and have already reshaped retail experience, what do you believe are the biggest challenges and opportunities for brands and leaders within brands trying to stay customer-centric in this new evolving environment?
There isn't a meeting that I go to these days where we don't talk about AI in some form. In fact, most board meetings that I sit in, we have AI presentations. Over the last year, if you ask me, is it changing more or less? I would say that the rate of change is even accelerating. There are more applications, there are more examples, there are more opportunities today than we even thought of or looked at a year ago. AI is transformative. We say that it's probably the biggest change in this generation. And we don't know what we don't know because we're just continuing to find the opportunities. When I think about it from a leadership perspective, I think about how do you create a culture of experimentation and trying, figure out where are the opportunities? How does it make us more productive? How do we use it for different forms of innovation? The challenge is how do you create that culture within the organization where people aren't fearful, hey, this is going to cut my job. And it's just a product, it's just a way of how do we have less people. I don't see it as that. I see it as being how do you make people a lot more productive and innovative. So I think that AI is transformative. I think it allows us to come up with ways of personalizing, ways of creating a consumer experience that is really differentiated. Using AI to do personalized websites, you'd be able to tell people based upon your own behavior what you ought to be looking at next, be able to customize the post-checkout offers for the consumer. This is all where AI and Gen AI is going.
Absolutely. We're seeing it in our business, we're seeing it across our partners' business, and then also new emerging businesses coming in around specific shopping agents, aggregating across the internet to then have that personalized experience for the consumer as well. Within this climate of economic uncertainty, I think you said a week ago, you would have said something very different to a week ago today. I'm not sure if we've ever had this up and down so quickly where we heads on a swivel trying to figure out what is happening here with tariffs and other things in such a short and intense period of time. Where do you see the clearest opportunities for retailers to unlock new revenue streams and or ideally drive growth?
I think that some of the basics that drive businesses haven't changed. I think it's about innovation. It's about customization. It's about understanding your consumer. I like telling a story. My grandfather was a retailer 100 years ago, and he had a little shop, and he knew in a small town in upstate New York, and he knew every one of his customers, and he bought to the individual customers and was able to cater to them. 100 years later, through whether it's AI, it's segmentation, it's data analytics, in some ways almost have the ability to do that experience that my grandfather did 100 years ago in today's environment at scale. And that's all we're doing is the basics of understanding what the consumer really wants. Think about a buyer. You're buying all kinds of stuff, but you don't really know what they want. So now having the tools to personalize the buy, then to be able to showcase it in a way that's for that person. Customize offers for them after they're making their purchase, making sure that it's a seamless experience, that after their post-shopping experience is really good. All of these tools are there, but the basics are the same, which is getting the right product to the right people at the right time and doing it in a way that people have a great experience and they want to come back. Giving people a bad experience or giving them the wrong product, all that does is accelerate a brand's demise.
I've always thought of personalization of thousands of ads, thousands of opportunities, getting to the right ad, to the right user, the right product, to the right user. But that thought then of the personal touch in your grandfather's story is really what personalization is. It just immediately gave me nostalgia versus personalization, which is this larger word that doesn't mean that, but it is the personal touch that we can do at scale there, which is really interesting. So I literally just felt, I'm walking into a shop and someone understands who I am. And that feeling is what now marketers should be able to provide, but in this new modern era.
Exactly. And do it in a digital manner, which never existed before.
One final question for our audience. What's one idea you think every marketer needs to hear right now?
I think it's that every marketer ought to go back to the basics and make sure that your brand or your positioning or your product, you really understand how it's differentiated in the marketplace. And you're back to the basics of understanding the 4 Ps, product, positioning, price, etc., that you really understand the basics. I've sat through some presentations recently where we're doing so much in the way of detailed analytics and understanding of all the data. And when you step back from it, they hadn't really understood what the brand stood for and how it was differentiated in the marketplace. Sometimes you can get down in the weeds without really understanding what your brand is all about. So I first challenge ourselves to do the background work of, does our brand have a differentiated positioning? How is it perceived by the consumer? Who is our consumer? All of those types of things, and then do all the fun stuff, which is to be so much more sophisticated in the analytics side of how you market than we ever were.
Great advice, and it ties back to one of the earlier points we were talking about is the brands that survive through these uncertain times are the ones that have that brand equity and value. And I think that ties back to that piece there, which is don't forget that. Hey, thank you very much for your time. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Appreciate it. Take care.